And welcome to a special episode of Classic Gamer 74. I'm your host, Anthony Gamer, and my name is Alligator. And today we are going to interview Dan Kitchen. Alright, Dan Kitchen needs no introduction, as many of you classic gamers know who he is. He was one of the founders of Activision. Yep. And he created many classic games, such as Crackpots. Yep. I love that game. So did I. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into the interview. You ready? You know it. All right, then. All right. So let's go ahead and begin. So first one, how did you first get into programming?
My brother Gary, who worked with me at Activision, he bought an Apple computer in 1978, and I started tinkering with it as well. And at about that time, I bought my first game for it, which was a Microsoft adventure. And it actually was the original Colossal Cave adventure that somebody ported to the Apple. Mm-hmm. And I loved it, so I fell in love with text adventures, and I ended up playing with it and started to learn 6502 assembly language after playing with BASIC for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I said, I think we can write a game. And at the time, Gary and I were working for an engineering firm in New Jersey that was doing a lot of electronic toy and game design. We designed a game called Bank Shot that was an electronic billiard game that Gary did the coding on. Mm-hmm. We worked on Wildfire Pinball for Parker Brothers, wrote the code in 4-bit microprocessor language. I did a number of game designs for a company called NPI, and so we were familiar with game designs and electronics and thought the best next thing would be to jump into programming.
Okay. Where did you get the idea for Crackpots? I mean, that game is, all the Activision games were unique, but that one is just probably the most unique of all of them, in my opinion.
It is. I was actually walking through town with, David Crane was out to visit us one time. As we set up the Activision Eastern Design Center, Dave would come out and visit every now and then, and we got really friendly with him. And we were walking through Glen Rock one time, and I remember seeing a guy who was working on a scaffold who was working on some windows on a scaffold and literally knocked over a flower pot and saw it explode on the ground. And I thought to myself, that's be kind of cool. It's almost like a reverse kaboom. And
right.
I think if you were trying to crawl up there, it would be fun to kind of have people drop things on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that concept started.
Okay. And what have you been up to since you left Activision?
Oh, a lot. Geez, I left Activision in 1986. I co-founded Absolute Entertainment with Gary and Dave. We did probably 100 or so games for the 16-bit systems through 1986 to 1995. Then I had a small multimedia company. I did a game with Christy Yamaguchi, the Olympic skater. I did a game based on the Casper movie with Universal Studios. I did Frogger for the Game Boy. And a Deer Hunter for the Game Boy, a bunch of other Game Boy games. And then I went to work for a company called Majesco in New Jersey, who was a remanufacturer of Super Nintendo games, and I brought them into the publishing arena and worked with them as a VP of license and product development, and probably produced or designed another 120 games.
Wow.
Across all the Game Boy systems, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. Did a Game Boy Advance video technology with them. Worked on the PS1, PS2, Xbox, all the way up to the Xbox One. So I did games in there, and then I left there. Worked with a company in India that designed games. I was their U.S. sales arm. And then I decided to leave them, and I started a company called Tiki Interactive, which is doing artwork and design work for companies who do free-to-play games on the internet. Mm-hmm. And just last year, I think you may have known, I decided to get back into the 2600 and actually started to write a game that I had started at Activision in 1983, which was a sequel to my brother Gary's hit Keystone KAPERS. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened after I started that game, about a month later, I found the cartridge of it that I had been looking for the last 35 years in an off-site storage.
Oh, wow.
And there were some articles about it, and I donated it to the National Video Game Museum. and I am now in the midst of completing the Keystone Capers 2 game, which was the little Keystone Capers cop running along a train in the middle of the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And the name has been changed to Gold Rush, and you can check it out on my game website, which is dankitchengames.com. And I expect to have that game done and out early next year.
Okay. One of the things, speaking of Activision, I know towards the end you seemed like you did a lot of ports, like the Ghostbusters. I know that was one you guys had done for computers, but like for instance, like Double Dragon and Kung Fu Master. I mean, why did you guys actually do those? Because honestly, I'd played Double Dragon like obsessively in the '80s, like a lot of kids, and honestly, I can't imagine playing that game with just one button. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Because you would.
It was a challenge.
Yeah. So.
It was definitely a challenge. Well, you know, we at the end of at the middle '80s, you know, the crash had happened.
Right.
Activision switched to a lot of the computer software, the game, not so much Apple, but a little tiny bit of Mac and Commodore 64 stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time, we had decided to leave Activision in 1986
Mm-hmm.
and start our own design firm, which we called Imagineering. And we still worked with Activision, and we worked with Atari and Acclaim. And some of those games, particularly the ports, Activision knew I was good at the hardware. And so they came to me and said, look, we have some ports. Can you do Ghostbusters? Then we have Kung Fu Master, Double Dragon. And about that time, I also wrote Crossbow for Atari.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was doing games that we started to publish ourselves, because about 1988, 89, there was a resurgence of the Atari 2600.
Mm-hmm.
So all the kids that had it, that had thrown it away or put it aside during the crash, their younger siblings picked it up 5 or 7 years later, and there was a market for games. And we were selling games to various clients, and then we started selling games ourselves to Toys R Us for some of the early Commodore games. And they came to us and said, hey, you guys did Atari 2600 at Activision. Can you do some now? Because there's a market for it. And that's when we got a call from Activision about the same time, who said, we want to hire you to do some games. And Kung Fu Master was one. Double Dragon was one, and that was a real challenge, Double Dragon.
Yeah. Because, I mean, in the arcade, it's got 3 buttons. You got punch, you know, kick, and then you got the jump, and then the combination, you could do the back elbow and all that stuff. So when I saw that on the Atari, I'm like, wow. You know? So.
It was. I actually worked with a guy who wrote some of the code with me, and I did a lot of the kernels. He did a lot of the gameplay code. That was one of the only times I ever partnered with a guy, and he, you know, he made it work with a combination of joystick moves and button,
right? And
it played okay. You know, the real part about that game I loved, which is you could drop the weapons and pick them up and start beating the hell out of the other guy, and we put some of that stuff in it, and we kind of did, I think, the best we could do on the machine.
Right. I mean, because that was ported to like everything. I mean, I had a version of it on the PC, and I remember that was it was okay. I mean, playable and stuff, but I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, like I said, it got ported everywhere. So
yeah, nothing beats the arcade. The arcade was the best one.
Oh no. Okay, so what is the story behind Absolute?
You know, when we left Activision in 1986, we started a company called Imagineering, and we both had a love for Disney. And Walt Disney called his group Imagineering. Mm-hmm. So we said, well, we can, you know, we're in New Jersey, they're in California. We looked, and the name was free, and we picked that name and started a development company. Did a bunch of games on the 2600. Did games on the Commodore. Did games on the 8-bit Nintendo system. I wrote with my brother. We wrote Bart versus the World. Bart versus Radioactive Man, Bart versus the Space Mutants, did a lot of the Simpsons games, and a lot of the licensed games, Home Alone, and various products. And we then decided to, as I mentioned earlier, to start publishing games. And we didn't want to put out the games under the Imagineering name. We came up with another name called Absolute. Mm-hmm. And so Absolute Entertainment was the publishing name of all the games. And then eventually we stopped doing client work and started just making games that we published and sold ourselves to the Targets, to the KB Toy and Hobby, to the not much to the Walmarts then, but to the Toys R Us's.
Mm-hmm.
And we changed the name of the company to Absolute Entertainment.
Okay. And that company went under a couple years later, or what happened with that?
Well, that went under in 1995. So we were in business for 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
My brother and I took the company public through a public offering and raised money. And we were a victim in the early 90s of the real downfall of the 16-bit systems, and there wasn't really the PS1s or the PCs coming up yet. So there was a real lull in the game business and in the console business. And with a lot of products we had done, specifically one a couple of years earlier called Toys. Do you remember the horrible movie?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were doing work. We actually were approached by the studio who did that and said, we're doing a movie about toys with Robin Williams, and Barry Levinson's the director, and it comes out at Christmas, and we need you to write a video game that's going to be in the movie. And so we thought that was great. And Gary had written Super Battle Tank and Battle Tank on the NES, and so they wanted a tank battle game. And so we modified our tank battle game to be the one that's played in the Toys movie. Mm-hmm. And we got the license for very cheap and did the games, and oh my God, the movie came out and it was the biggest turd of all time. And we sold hundreds of thousands, well, thousands and thousands of products to Toys R Us. And I remember at one point they were like selling 6 units a week. Wow. And it's like we sat on thousands of amounts of inventory that we eventually had to pay money to Toys R Us to get rid of it.
Oh, geez.
And so we took a big financial hit, and we did that happen on a couple of our products that were movie licenses. And we learned not to really deal with movie licenses.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1995, when we just finished, you may have heard of Penn and Teller Smoke and Mirrors?
Yeah, isn't that the one that never got released?
That's correct. I produced it. I work with Penn and Teller. Blondie was in it. Lou Reed was in it. And we made the game, and it was a fabulous product. And the day that it was released from Sega for manufacturing, we filed for bankruptcy, and we couldn't make the game.
Oh, geez.
So that was the end of Absolute in 1995.
Are the ROMs of that game floating around somewhere?
They absolutely are. And
okay.
As a matter of fact, there was a game that we designed in that called Desert Bus.
Oh, geez.
And you're familiar with it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've never played it. I just remember James Rolfe talked about it, and you just kind of like, wow,
Well, we were sitting in our conference room with Penn and Teller, one design meeting, and Penn looked at us and said, I want to do the most boring game of all time.
Mm-hmm.
We said, hey, that's funny. We've played a lot of games that were boring, And he said, how about driving a bus from Tucson to Las Vegas in real time? And you can't do anything. You can't even put down the controller because every few seconds the bus veers off the road. So you got to keep touching the controller, and nothing at all happens for 8 hours, except at 4.5 hours, little mosquito squishes on the window. And we all laughed for a while and said, oh God, that's so much fun. And Penn says, when you get to Vegas, you get 1 point. And then you got to turn around and go back in real time, another 8 hours.
Wow.
And so we thought it was funny and brilliant, and we created it and put it in Smoke and Mirrors. And lo and behold, 20 years later, there's a comedy group in Toronto that does Desert Bus for Hope. And they have a charity where they raise millions of dollars for children's cancer. And they do that by having people play Desert Bus with them. And for every mile or every hour, they get cash from people pledging. And so they've raised, I think this year in November, they raised like $1.4 million
wow.
for children's cancer, and Penn and Teller are involved. And so I'm glad to see that our game at least did some good.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow, that's amazing. Huh.
It's a lot of fun to work on.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So, speaking of programmers, what would be your advice to give to potential game programmers?
Well, I'll tell you, it's different now than when I started. When I started, there wasn't anywhere you could learn it. We were really pioneers. I remember we built all our hardware. Gary is an engineer by schooling. I was an engineer by picking it up. And we had these Apple computers that you could take the top off of and access the circuit board inside. So we made little cards that we wired up by hand, and you plugged into it, and you ran it to the 2600, and you dumped code into the RAM of the cartridge, and it played like the ROM on a cartridge. And we just learned by doing. And these days, there's so many courses in colleges to teach gameplay and 3D and 2D video game design and game design. I would encourage people today to, if they want to be a developer and a programmer, definitely learn programming with C++ or JavaScript. Taking courses in game design would be good. If they have an artistic flair, definitely learn some of these 3D tools like Maya or 3D Studio Max. And if they're interested in doing gameplay, they should go do some game design courses, and they should start a job in a company as a video game tester. Because when I ran my companies, I always promoted the guys who were testers to be game producers.
Oh, wow.
Because they played the games so much, and they played so many different games, that they knew eventually what made the game fun. And that's the exact kind of guy you want to produce a game, so that he can help the programmer and help the artist make the game as fun as possible. And he really learned those skills by testing all the games.
Okay. All right. Do you feel the 2600 is still relevant today?
You know, I do. I mean, I'm writing code on it now. And certainly these days, you can, we had at Activision, we had the DPC chip, which Dave had designed to do Pitfall 2. And there's people still using the DPC chip. There's people using coprocessors. There's cartridges you can get that have coprocessors that make it easier to design on the machine. And it actually allows you to do some tricks where you're actually able to store more information on the machine than we could, because you're not just running the game out of a ROM, you're running it out of a ROM with another processor. So those kind of things have made it more relevant for today. And frankly, I've played PC games, I've played Xbox games, all these other things. There's nothing like plugging in a cartridge and having it instantly come up in a millisecond and grabbing a controller that doesn't have 47 buttons on it, that may not have enough buttons, but has one button, 8 directions, and I can instantly get into the game, and I can instantly get pleasure playing it. And I think it's as relevant today as it was then, and I think that's why people are getting into this whole retro game boom. I think they relive their childhood. These guys are probably 30s and 40s, as we are, or I'm a little older.
Right.
And it gives them good times when they were growing up and they got their Sega Genesis or Nintendo or Mario or God forbid E.T. cartridge, and they brings them back good memories, and it's very fun. That's the one thing we did back then that people kind of lost sight of, is we only had a screen and 2 players and a missile and a little ball object and some background that was very, very pixelated to make something fun. We didn't have 3D graphics. We didn't have speech. We didn't have voice. We had very limited hardware, but we had to make a fun experience. And these days, a lot of the games hide behind their 3D and their 3D open world, and not games like GTA 3 or Red Dead Redemption, but other games have done that, and they just lose their fun gameplay ability because they're trying to do so much and make it so complicated.
Oh yeah, I agree. But I'll tell you though, I actually liked that ET game back in the day. But that was
I
just
didn't
me.
mind it either, between you and me.
Okay.
I just fell into a lot of holes. I kept falling into holes.
I still do. I still do when I play it.
But it's still nostalgic, and I still like it.
Oh yeah. All right, so let's go back to the crash of '83 and '84.
Yes.
What do you think actually caused it, and could it have been prevented? And what do you think might have happened if the crash hadn't happened?
You know, I can answer all those questions.
Okay.
Gary and I think at one point in 1983, we went to a Video Shack here in New Jersey. We walked in to look at the games from Activision and Atari. We'd often go in to look at our games, and there's our product. And that night we looked and we saw another game from somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, holy crap! There's another game by somebody else, and it was called SKEET Shoot from Games by Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
And I met Ed Salvo after that, who's the programmer and very nice guy. But it was, so we turned the box around, and we were just shocked at how bad the quality was.
Mm-hmm.
And Gary looked at me that night and said, Dan, this is the end of the business. And he was dead on. Because what happened is you got people who did what Gary did, which is back engineer the system. He learned how to do that. He wrote Space Jockey. Good game. And then we joined Activision. We did our products. And then eventually in 83, 84, other companies started to learn how the system worked, but they created games that were really subpar and not good quality. Some of them were good, and some of them were not. And then you'd had a flood of games hitting the market, and you'd have toy buyers who say, you know, I can buy all these games. Why should I pay $40 to you, Activision, wholesale for a game when I can get it over here for $10 from Games by Apollo?
Mm-hmm.
And they did that. So many people did that there was a flood of games in the market, and they ended up being in bins for $2. Mm-hmm. And we would still have a brand new Atari game up on the shelf. And they would walk in and, you know, they would tell us, customers would say, why am I going to spend $50 on Crackpots or on, you know, Pitfall 2 or on Pressure Cooker when I can go over to that bin and get 5 games from Atari for $2 each? And you couldn't argue with them.
Right.
But the games weren't the same.
No.
They didn't know. They were buying it for their kids. So then comes Nintendo.
Yep.
They come in, 86, I think, 85.
Yeah.
And they sell the NES. And, oh, my God, that's one of the greatest games ever.
Oh, yeah.
And we contacted them to do work for the system. And there was a tremendous rigmarole of paperwork. And then they said, we make all the games. We manufacture all the games for you. And then we tell you how many you can make. And we were like, this is like anti-American. This is anti-capitalistic. You can't do that. Well, that itself saved the video game business. Mm-hmm. Because we did work for people like Acclaim. And when we did Bart versus the Space Mutants, Jimmy Skrzepowski of Acclaim and Greg Fishback wanted to build 1 million units to ship that Christmas because he had orders for 1 million pieces. Well, Nintendo went to him and said, nope, we only have 400,000 pieces of silicon that we've allocated to you. So we're only going to make 400,000 pieces. And they were like all pissed off, you know, I got all these orders. And Nintendo said, nope, we're allocating chips so that we regulate the market. And they were even sued by some companies for for anti-capitalism and for taking a monopoly on the business. But I got to tell you, by slowly letting games out without a bunch of games, without hundreds and thousands of them, and doing it slowly, various units at a time, they slowly built the business back up, and the retailers began to make money, and the people began to play good first-party games, and they've saved the video game business by doing that. So if that was done in the Atari days, and if Atari had been the one to regulate who made games for their system, the crash could have been prevented.
All right, so you'd mentioned about some of the new games that are coming out. What other than there was another one other than the Gold Rush game, correct?
Yes, I have one coming out called Bon Voyage, which is it's kind of a Grand Prix meets Sequest.
Oh, okay.
You're piloting across the screen the Titanic, a Titanic-looking boat, which is a luxury liner in the 1940s, and you've got to dodge all these rocks and then eventually all these icebergs, and you have to make sure you don't crash into the iceberg and sink. And while you're doing this, you're picking up little guys like the divers in SeaQuest who are on top of the water waving and swimming.
Oh, wow.
And so you're picking up, and every time you pick up a guy, there's a little life preserver that appears on the screen. And you're picking up these guys who have been part of a shipwreck. And once you pick up enough of them, you get 6 bonus points, and you go pick up more, and eventually you reach the other end to another harbor, and the game repeats as you go back the other direction.
Boy,
and that game is going to be done probably by the middle of next year.
Okay, yeah, that definitely sounds like an Activision game. That's got Activision. I mean, screams Activision there. So I mean,
I was sitting in a tiki bar in California, thinking to myself, I was just working on the Keystone Capers 2 game that I had started 35 years ago, and I said, what kind of game would I do if I was Activision again? And I kind of racked my brain and thought, I like those big posters of those Titanic ships and stuff from the Cunard line and the White Star Line posters of the ship. I said, I bet you Titanic would be cool. Do an ocean voyage, and you do a beautiful sunset on the water with the sun shimmering, and you use the Activision's rainbow like we used to do. And
right.
It all kind of fell into place in a couple of minutes of having a Mai Tai. It all fit in place.
Okay. Now, as regards to Keystone Gold Rush, why did you change it to Gold Rush instead of keeping it as Keystone Capers 2?
Well, all my life in my career, I've worked with licenses, and I really respect intellectual property. And the reality is, I do not own the name Keystone Capers. I don't own the character; those are still owned by Activision. As you can see, At Games has put out the flashback units, and they have our Activision games in them, and so Keystone Capers is still in all the units. So I would not use the Keystone Capers name, even a part of it, or use the Keystone Capers cop without going back to Activision and licensing the character and the name.
Okay.
And I realized, well, it's a Keystone Capers 2 game, but it's been 35 years. I'm going to make the guy a conductor on the train, and he's Keystone Kelly's cousin.
Okay.
And Keystone Kelly's back in New York working in the department store, and this guy's out here, and what would be a fun thing to collect on an old Western train? I thought gold.
Oh, yeah.
And so my wife just kind of said one time, I think a good name would be Gold Rush, because you're rushing around the train, and you're trying to get it before time runs out, and you're picking up gold. And I said, well, Gold Rush, the 1840s, that's brilliant. So we ended up using Gold Rush.
Okay. Yeah, I like it. I'm really looking forward to it because, I mean, I was a fool for Keystone Capers because I love silent movies and I love, Chaplin and, those films. So, I mean,
absolutely, yes.
Okay, what's your brother up to these days?
Gary's still in the game business, but he's doing... He spends all his time now doing expert witness legal work. So, like, if there's a company that's suing Activision for something in Call of Duty, or they're suing a company who copied Call of Duty, or there's an arcade dispute with something, companies hire people like Gary to evaluate the case and to be an expert in talking about the video game part of the lawsuit. And that's what he does pretty much all the time now. He's not designing any games these days. Okay.
Do you keep in touch with any of your other former colleagues from Activision?
I do. Dave Crane works with Gary, so I speak to Dave often. I still keep in touch with Steve Cartwright, who is just an amazing designer, kind of one of my heroes. I go to the retro gaming shows. I went to Portland this year. I went to the Let's Play in Dallas, and I got to sit with some of the old Atari guys, Rob Zadibble, who was phenomenal in doing Warbirds on the Lynx, and the chap who wrote the original Adventure. And yeah, I'm able to sit with some of these guys and kind of hook up after all these years. When we used to see them at the old Consumer Electronics shows, it's nice to still stay in touch.
Okay. What was your favorite game that you programmed, and what was your favorite game that you didn't program?
My favorite game that I programmed, I think, would be Crackpots. I still go back and play that one.
Oh, yeah.
Although I enjoy Kung Fu Master 2. Actually, strangely, I still go back and play my very first text adventure, which was published by Hayden Software in 1981, and it was called Crystal Caverns, and it was a full sentence recognition text adventure like Zork and Zork 2. And I actually still go and play that, and sometimes don't remember where to go in the mazes and the caves. And the game I play most that I didn't design is SeaQuest. I still play SeaQuest to this day.
Oh, okay. And what about future plans?
Well, at this point, I'm the only original game designer who has come back from, quote, retirement to write new games for the Atari 2600. I'm going to finish Gold Rush soon, and I'm going to finish Bon Voyage, and I have a couple of more that I like to do for next year. In addition, I also do a lot of board game design, tabletop game design, and I have a brand new one that's being kickstarted in a few months called Drive-In, which is kind of unique. You're playing with 5 people or 2 to 5 people, and you're parking these little colored cars on a 1950s drive-in to pick the spots and try to make like the longest continuous line of your cars, and you can bump the players off, and you can do various things. And the cool thing is it can be played with or without a companion app that is going to have a bunch of old sci-fi movies on it. So part of the gameplay as you play is you have these movie cards, and when you play them, you interact with the iPad that plays the trailers to a lot of the old sci-fi movies as part of the gameplay.
Cool.
So you like playing the Plan 9 from Outer Space card, and you select it on the iPad, and it turns into a drive-in screen, and now it's playing a drive-in movie of Plan 9 from Outer Space, the trailer, and all the original trailers from a bunch of B movies from the 50s, and I've got the license for 3,000 movies to put on that, and then you can play the game with different genres of movies, westerns, romance, film noir, sci-fi. So that game I'm actually kickstarting that game in March, and I think I'm very excited because it plays really, really well, and it's been taken to all the gameplay cons for tabletop games. And next year I'm going to be focusing on more tabletop and card games, and probably another 2 or 3 more Atari 2600 games.
Wow. Okay. So do you have any message for the fans?
I want to thank you for playing the games throughout the years. We really enjoyed making them. Definitely have a passion for games, and I just want to say look forward to my new 2600 games under the publishing name of Tiki Vision. And if they go to my website at dankitchengames.com, they can sign up to our mailing list, and they'll get a bunch of information. And I'm also putting out, in addition to the Gold Rush game, we're creating 70 collectible cards for the different characters and objects in the game. And those will be trading cards that you can get. And I think we'll be doing a Kickstarter in February to kind of raise some money for the manufacturing. These days, it's obviously not a lot of people making cartridges, and I'm going to be working with a guy to make a mold so that we can make cartridges instead of having to rip apart old games, because I don't really like doing that. I like to keep the old games preserved. And we'll be raising some money to do that, and irregardless, be releasing the game sometime, I think, in March. So look for my games, but thank you for playing our old games, and just rock on, man. Just flip that switch, grab that joystick, and have a good time.
All right, Dan. Well, thank you for sharing some of your time with us, and I really appreciate it. So thank you again. I thank you for your time and for talking with me.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay. Well, that concludes this episode of Classic Gamer 74. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. And let's hope in the future we can actually get some more interviews with other programmers, especially some of the homebrew people. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give us a big thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about Christmas homebrews, so be sure and tune in for that. Well, this has been Anthony Gamer, and I'm Alligator, and we will see you on the next episode. Until then, have a great day. Goodbye.